The War of the Roses, a tumultuous period of English history spanning from 1455 to 1487, is often reduced to a binary conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. Yet this perspective is misleading, as the reality is steeped in a rich tapestry of intricate relationships, personal ambitions, and shifting allegiances. Driven by the relentless quest for power, the nobility of England became embroiled in a struggle that was as much about personal vendettas and ancient grudges as it was about dynastic claims. Consequently, to comprehend the motivations behind the protracted civil strife, one must delve beyond the prominent figures like Henry VI or Richard III and explore the lesser-known players whose machinations shaped the tides of this bloody saga. In the midst of this conflict, a collective psychological state permeated the land. The nobility was not merely jockeying for power, they were enacting a drama steeped in honor, revenge, and a desire for legacy. The political landscape of the time was punctuated by a deep-seated belief in the divine right of kings, a notion that imbued the struggle with an air of moral righteousness. Letters penned in the dim light of flickering candles, like one from Margaret of Anjou to her allies, reveal not only strategic calculations, but also an emotional weight, her desperation as she implored support for her husband, Henry VI, a man increasingly seen as a pawn in a game of nobles. Such documents, which capture the fervor of the moment, are fundamental in understanding the complexities of the War of the Roses. Furthermore, the roles of figures like the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Warwick were instrumental in the unfolding drama, yet they often remain overshadowed by their more famous contemporaries. The Duke of Somerset, for instance, whose loyalty to Henry VI was unwavering, nonetheless played a pivotal role in the Lancastrian cause. His military actions and strategic decisions, such as the ill-fated Battle of St. Albans in 1455, had consequences that rippled through the ranks of both factions. Somerset's failure to secure a decisive victory led to a fracturing of Lancastrian morale, pushing many of their supporters to reconsider their allegiances. Inevitably, this paved the way for the rise of new power brokers, such as Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, often referred to as the Kingmaker. His shifting loyalties, dictated by personal ambition and fraught relationships, highlight the capricious nature of allegiance during this period. Compounding the intricacies of this conflict were the personal vendettas that instigated a cycle of violence and retribution. Many battles were not merely fought for land or titles, they were driven by deep-seated grudges that had festered over generations. Take, for instance, the enmity between the Neville family and the Percys, which culminated at the Battle of Towton in 1461, an engagement that remains infamous for its brutality. On that fateful day, the sun shone on a battlefield soaked in blood, where histories of personal animosity became entwined with the larger narratives of power. Letters exchanged in the weeks leading up to the battle reveal an atmosphere thick with tension as both sides prepared for what would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. A soldier, perhaps no more than 20, would march into that fray, driven not by a sense of duty to the crown, but by a desire for vengeance against an old enemy, embodying the personal stakes that underpinned the wider struggle. Moreover, the allegiances of nobles were notoriously fluid, shifting in response to the tumultuous tides of war. The precariousness of loyalty is starkly illustrated through the actions of individuals like George, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV, and a figure who oscillated between loyalty to the Yorkists and aspirations for his own power. His decision to ally momentarily with the Lancastrians, motivated by personal grievances against his brother, underscores the fragile nature of kinship in a time marked by treachery. Had he chosen differently, Had the bonds of brotherly loyalty been stronger than ambition, the trajectory of the war could have changed dramatically. It is a poignant reminder of how easily history can pivot on the fulcrum of individual choice. In addition, the role of women in this conflict, often relegated to the sidelines of historical narratives, deserves attention. Figures like Margaret of Anjou wielded considerable influence, not merely as supporters of their husbands, but as political actors in their own right. Her staunch defense of Henry VI and her fervent campaigns against the Yorkists reveal a woman unafraid to step into the male-dominated arena of power. The insights gleaned from her correspondence, detailing the strategies employed to rally support and consolidate power, illustrate that the struggle for the throne was as much an emotional battle as it was a political one. As the war drew to a close, the consequences of these myriad alliances and betrayals became increasingly evident. The ascent of Henry Tudor, a figure previously considered a fringe claimant, was facilitated by the very fractures that marked the conflict. The Battle of Bosworth in 1885, often viewed as the climactic conclusion of the War of the Roses, was marked by the absence of key supporters who had been alienated by the turmoil of shifting allegiances. The ghost of Richard III, the last Yorkist king, lingered as a reminder of what had been lost amid the swirling ambitions of nobles. Facing defeat, Richard's desperate charge into battle, his final stand, epitomized the tragic culmination of a conflict driven by both personal vendettas and the relentless quest for power. Ultimately, the legacy of the War of the Roses extends far beyond the immediate outcomes of the battles fought. It laid the groundwork for the Tudor dynasty and reshaped the political landscape of England in ways that resonate to this day. The borders drawn by ambition, betrayal, and the ever-shifting loyalties of the nobility would define not only the future of the monarchy, but also the very fabric of English governance. In this sense, the hidden tides of power that characterized this tumultuous era continue to echo in the corridors of modern political life, serving as a stark reminder of how the past informs the present. The intricate web of interests and emotions that fueled this civil strife ultimately crafted a narrative that remains compelling, a testament to the myriad forces that shape our histories. In the mid-15th century, England was a nation caught in the throes of uncertainty, rife with political intrigue and power struggles that ebbed and flowed like the tides of the North Sea. The Lancastrian monarchy, led by King Henry VI, was beset by weaknesses that undermined its authority. Driven by the king's bouts of mental instability, the court became a battleground of ambitious nobles, each vying for influence in a kingdom yearning for stability, yet teetering on the brink of chaos. It was within this fraught atmosphere that the House of York began to emerge as a formidable contender for the throne. Richard, Duke of York, stood as a pivotal figure, his lineage providing a claim to the crown that was both legitimate and politically advantageous. A man of considerable ambition, Richard sought to position himself as the antidote to the ineffective rule of the Lancasters. His motivations were not merely personal. They were reflective of a broader dissatisfaction among the nobility and the common populace, who felt increasingly disenfranchised by a king unable to govern. Consequently, Richard's actions were not just about seizing power. They resonated with a collective yearning for a ruler capable of restoring order to a fractious realm. As tensions simmered, the nascent conflict crystallized with the First Battle of St. Albans in May 1455. This battle, while seemingly a localized skirmish, served as a flashpoint that would ignite the Wars of the Roses. The Yorkists, under Richard's command, clashed with Lancastrian forces. Just as the sun broke over the horizon that fateful day, soldiers on both sides could feel the weight of destiny pressing down upon them. The battle was marked by an unexpected ferocity. A letter penned by a Lancastrian knight, penned in bloodied ink amidst the chaos, later recounted how the grass ran red with the blood of both friends and foes. Such vivid imagery encapsulated the brutality of the conflict, yet it also reflected the fervor with which the Yorkists fought. Inevitably, the Yorks emerged victorious, paving the way for Richard to assert his claim and gather support from disaffected nobles. In the aftermath of this decisive engagement, Richard's position was strengthened, yet the political landscape remained precarious. The victory at St. Albans did not extinguish the Lancastrian fire. Instead, it ignited further hostilities as Henry VI's supporters rallied to reclaim their influence. This relentless jockeying for power revealed the psychological state of the time, an atmosphere thick with betrayal and shifting loyalties. The people were not merely passive witnesses to the unfolding drama. They were caught in a whirlwind of allegiances that could shift like the changing winds of a stormy sea. In this landscape of uncertainty, Edward, Richard's eldest son, began to emerge as a military leader in his own right, inheriting not only the ambitions of his father, but also the aspirations of a faction desperate for change. Consequently, as Edward took command, the Yorkists began to refine their strategies, blending military might with cunning political maneuvering. The Battle of Towton in March 1461 would become a testament to their resolve. Fought on a day marked by a biting wind and swirling snow, Towton saw the largest army ever assembled on English soil at the time. On that field, men were not just soldiers, they were fathers, brothers, and sons, driven by a desire for a life free from the shadow of tyranny. A common foot soldier, mere hours before the clash, penned a letter to his sister, revealing his fears, yet also a stubborn hope for a new England, one where the Yorkists could usher in a brighter future. The battle itself unfolded in a cacophony of clashing steel and agonized cries, with Edward's forces employing a strategic use of archers that would ultimately prove devastating to the Lancastrians. As arrows rained down like vengeful spirits, the Lancastrian line faltered. Those who survived the melee fled, leaving behind a field stained not only with blood, but also with the remnants of shattered dreams. The victory at Towton was not merely a military triumph. It was a turning point that fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the realm. Edward, now crowned king, stood atop a mountain of corpses, a grim reminder of the cost of ambition and the fragility of power. However, the path to Yorkist dominance was not without its complications. Shifting allegiances played a crucial role in the unfolding drama of the Wars of the Roses. As Edward rose to power, former Lancastrian supporters found themselves grappling with their loyalty, some choosing to defect, while others clung stubbornly to a fading cause. A weathered nobleman, once a staunch Lancastrian, recalled the conversations held in hushed tones, where fear of reprisal mingled with a dawning realization that the tides had irrevocably turned. This constant realignment of loyalties served to underscore the instability of the period, reinforcing the notion that power was a fleeting specter, ever evasive and easily lost. As the House of York cemented its place, the legacy of these early battles and the ensuing political maneuverings would resonate through time. The scars left on the landscape of England bore witness to a struggle that transcended mere succession. It encapsulated the bitter conflict between two houses, each representing divergent visions for the future of the kingdom. Beneath the surface of these grand narratives lay the stories of countless individuals, men and women,
whose fates were inexorably intertwined with the ambitions of their leaders. These are the lives forever altered by decisions made in the heat of conflict, where a single act of defiance or a moment of hesitation could dictate the course of history. In a realm where power is as fragile as the lives it governs, the rise of the House of York stands not only as a chapter of ambition and strife, but a poignant reminder of the human cost of political ambition. The echoes of their struggle resonate today, a testament to how the legacies of the past continue to shape the present, reminding us that the battles fought on those blood-soaked fields still cast long shadows over the corridors of power in modern society.
In the tumultuous landscape of 15th century England, where the winds of change howled across battle-scarred fields, the Yorkist coalition found itself at the precipice of chaos. The fervor that had initially united them began to fray, unraveling under the weight of ambition, distrust, and the relentless pursuit of power. Driven by this internal strife, the banners of loyalty that once represented a shared cause began to show signs of disrepair. Key allies, once stalwart in their commitment to the House of York, began to waver, swayed by the allure of self-preservation and the seductive whispers from rival factions. Consequently, the grip of the Yorkists weakened, opening the door for devastating betrayals that would ripple through the political landscape, leaving destruction in their wake. The psychological state of the era was one of palpable tension, a collective anxiety born from the protracted conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster. In the town of Coventry, whispers of treachery swirled through the crowded taverns, where men gathered to discuss not only the latest skirmishes, but also the shifting allegiances that could spell ruin for one faction or another. As the sun rose on that fateful day in 1469, the air was thick with the scent of impending violence, the sound of steel on steel echoing in the minds of those who dared to dream of peace. Yet the dream was cruelly elusive, as the very foundations of trust began to crumble under the pressure of ambition. The defection of George, Duke of Clarence, marked a significant turning point in this narrative of betrayal. Once a key figure within the Yorkist fold, Clarence's ambitions drew him towards the Lancaster cause, a decision steeped in both personal grievance and political calculation. His betrayal was not merely a shift in allegiance, it represented a fracturing of unity that sent shockwaves through the Yorkist ranks. The swirling rumors of his motives, laden with speculation and resentment, ignited distrust among former allies. Consequently, this turbulence did not only fracture the coalition, it revealed the fissures in loyalty that underpinned their very alliance. Letters exchanged between nobles during this period, filled with veiled threats and promises of support, only heightened the sense of paranoia that gripped both houses. As the dust settled in the aftermath of these events, the legacies of betrayal and ambition would leave indelible marks on the fabric of English society. The wounds inflicted during this tumultuous period would not heal easily, as the scars of conflict lingered long after the battles were fought. The cycle of betrayal would continue to haunt the political landscape, setting a precedent for future generations as they navigated the treacherous waters of loyalty and ambition. In contemporary reflections on conflict, the lessons learned from this period remain profoundly relevant, reminding us of the perils of unchecked ambition and the complexities of allegiance in an unforgiving world. The Battle of Towton, fought on a bleak March day in 1461, remains etched in the annals of English history, not merely as a confrontation between rival factions, but as the crucible in which the fate of a kingdom was forged. The War of the Roses had already raged for years, a relentless struggle over the English throne, and the air was thick with tensions that erupted into this vast and violent clash. The Yorkists, led by Edward IV, sought to solidify their claim against the Lancastrians, whose hold on the crown had been characterized by instability and strife. Driven by this relentless pursuit of power, the two sides amassed forces that would soon come to symbolize the brutality of civil war in England. As the day approached, a combination of weather and strategy would play a pivotal role in shaping the outcome of this conflict. The morning of the battle dawned cold and overcast, with a biting wind sweeping across the fields of Towton. A letter penned by a soldier prior to the clash described the chill as the kind that seeps into the bones, heralding not only the physical trials to come, but also the emotional weight that bore down on the men about to engage in battle. Consequently, the weather not only affected the morale of the troops, but also the tactics employed by both commanders. Edward IV's forces, bolstered by their knowledge of the terrain and the wind-swept hills, prepared to take advantage of the elements, as did their Lancastrian adversaries, who were equally resolute in their quest to reclaim the throne. The psychological state of the era was one of fierce loyalty and unyielding resolve. Soldiers on both sides were driven by a mixture of duty and desperation, bolstered by their allegiance to their respective houses. The notions of honor, loyalty, and kingship were imbued with a fervor that translated into the willingness to face death on the battlefield. As men lined up in serried ranks, they were not just soldiers, they were fathers, sons, and brothers united by a cause that resonated deeply within the fractious society of 15th century England. This complex web of loyalty manifested in the sheer scale of the battle, as an estimated 50,000 combatants took to the field, making Towton not only the largest battle of the War of the Roses, but also one of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. Inevitably, the brutality of the day unfolded as the armies clashed, the din of metal striking metal reverberating across the battlefield. The combat was characterized by chaos and carnage, with men fighting not just against each other, but against the very elements that sought to impede them. The mud, churned up by the relentless stomping of thousands of feet, became a graveyard of lost hopes and shattered dreams. A particularly harrowing moment is captured in the chronicles of an unnamed foot soldier who, overwhelmed by the chaos, described watching his comrade fall, a mere shadow in the shifting tides of battle. "We were but men," he wrote, "lost in a tempest of blood and fury." This visceral account illustrates the individual tragedies that lay behind the larger narrative of war, reminding us that every statistic reflects a life extinguished. With each passing hour, the tide of battle shifted, yet the outcome seemed foreordained. Edward IV's forces, bolstered not only by superior strategy, but also by a relentless onslaught, began to push the Lancastrians back. The decisive moment came when the Yorkists unleashed a volley of arrows that rained down upon the Lancastrian troops, who, disorganized and demoralized, faltered under the relentless assault. Nevertheless, the cost was staggering. By nightfall, the battlefield lay strewn with the dead and dying, the cries of the wounded mingling with the howling wind. Estimates suggest that around 28,000 men perished that day, a staggering toll that reverberated through the lives of families and communities, leaving an indelible scar on the national psyche. In the immediate aftermath of Towton, the landscape of power within England shifted dramatically. The Yorkists emerged victorious, their hold on the crown seemingly solidified. Edward IV was formally declared king, and Lancaster's forces were left in disarray. Yet this victory came with a profound cost, not merely in terms of lives lost, but also in the resources depleted and the social fabric torn asunder. Fields that had once been fertile now lay soaked in blood, a grim testament to the ferocity of the struggle for power. Towns and villages, once vibrant with community life, found themselves fractured under the weight of grief and loss. The psychological consequences of such a vast and brutal conflict fostered an atmosphere of mistrust and animosity that would linger long after the last arrows had been fired. As the victors celebrated their hard-won triumph, they faced the daunting task of uniting a fractured realm. The enormity of the loss weighed heavily on Edward IV and his supporters, as they grappled with the knowledge that their victory had intensified the desperation and determination of those they had vanquished. Had the Lancasters managed to withstand the onslaught just a little longer, or had a single commander made a different choice, the trajectory of history might have taken a vastly different course, prolonging the conflict and deepening the scars of civil war. Towton thus stands as a turning point, not only in the War of the Roses, but also in the broader narrative of English history. The battle marked a shift from the chaotic rivalry of noble houses to a more centralized authority under the Yorkist crown, yet it also foreshadowed the continued strife that England would face in the years to come. The blood shed at Towton echoed through the ages, a reminder that the quest for power comes at a steep price, one that continues to resonate in the corridors of political ambition today. In the decades that followed, the lessons of Towton would linger, a poignant reflection of the fragility of peace and the ease with which loyalty can be fractured. In the end, the land that witnessed such profound violence would become a symbol of both tragedy and resilience, reminding future generations of the costs associated with the pursuit of power, a legacy that remains pertinent in contemporary discourse on governance and conflict.
As the dust began to settle on the fields of Towton, the blood-soaked battleground that epitomized the War of the Roses, a profound transformation gripped England. The conflict, a bitter struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York, had finally forged a new path, though its legacy would be felt for generations. In this crucible of violence, the Tudor dynasty emerged, rising from the ashes of a war that had ravaged families and dismantled the very fabric of society. Driven by this fierce desire for stability, Henry Tudor claimed the throne as Henry VII, marking the dawn of a new era, yet shadowed by the scars of division and rivalry that lingered in the hearts and minds of the populace. The bitter rivalry had not merely been a contest for a crown. It had incited widespread disillusionment with the monarchy itself. The war laid bare the fragility of governance, and in its wake, the necessity for a more centralized authority became abundantly clear. Consequently, the Tudor monarchs would wield their power with an iron grip, instituting reforms that sought to diminish the influence of the aristocracy, whose feudal loyalties had so easily fractured into chaos. A letter penned in 1485 by Thomas More captures this zeitgeist, expressing a yearning among the common folk for peace and order, a stark contrast to the devastation that had unfolded. It was a longing that would lead Henry VII to implement measures aimed at curbing the power of the nobility, shifting the balance of authority toward a stronger central governance. Yet the path to this newfound stability was fraught with the echoes of past grievances. The psychological state of the era was one of mistrust and trepidation. People walked the streets of London not only with the hope of a better future, but also burdened by the memories of betrayed allegiances and bloodshed that had permeated their lives. The specter of conflict loomed large,
a constant reminder that peace was often a fragile construct. Inevitably, these historical scars would prompt the Tudor regime to foster a narrative of unity, one that would allow them to consolidate power while erasing the traces of division stemming from the war. The impact of the War of the Roses extended beyond the political realm. The social structures that had defined English life for centuries began to shift as well. In the wake of the conflict, a notable transformation occurred among the emerging middle class, whose members began to assert themselves in ways previously unimagined. With the nobility's power waning, the merchants and tradespeople found new opportunities for wealth and influence. The remnants of the old order, represented by the defeated Yorkists, now faced a daunting future filled with uncertainty. A textile merchant in Bristol, for instance, saw his fortunes soar as the demand for wool intensified, propelled by the need for financial stability in a country trying to heal its wounds. Thus, the very fabric of society began to reweave itself, intertwining the aspirations of commoners with the authority of the crown. However, the cultural memory of the war would prove to be a double-edged sword. While the Tudors sought to forge a cohesive identity for their realm, the scars of division remained etched in the collective consciousness. The annual observances of the battles, along with the tales of valor and betrayal, were recounted in taverns and gatherings, fostering a sense of both nostalgia and resentment. Consequently, the stories of the fallen, the stalwart defenders of York and Lancaster, became interwoven in the national narrative, leaving an indelible mark on the English psyche. A ballad sung in a dimly lit pub in York recounts the valor of a nameless knight who perished at the Battle of Tewkesbury, a poignant reminder that every casualty carried a story that echoed through time. The Tudor dynasty, while successful in establishing a semblance of peace, also faced the challenge of shaping a narrative that would effectively mitigate the lingering divisions. The reign of Henry VII was characterized by calculated marriages and alliances, culminating in the union of his son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, linking the Tudor name not only to English nobility, but also to the powerful Spanish crown. Driven by the desire to fortify his dynasty, Henry VII's strategies embodied the recognition that governance was not merely about rule, but also about perception. He understood that the survival of his lineage depended upon crafting an image of legitimacy that resonated with the populace, a task made all the more complex by the memories of the war that still haunted many. Had the tides of war turned differently, had Richard III emerged victorious at Bosworth Field, the course of English history would have diverged dramatically. The Lancastrians' defeat would have solidified Yorkist power, leading to an alternative narrative where the echoes of feudal loyalty might have reinforced the aristocracy rather than diminish it. In such a reality, the Tudor dynasty might never have been born, and the political landscape would have been shaped by a different set of values and alliances. This fragility of history serves as a potent reminder of how chance and fate entwine, molding the destinies of nations through the smallest of decisions. As the Tudor reign unfolded, the cultural implications of the War of the Roses continued to permeate English life. The language of the era evolved, influenced by the rhetoric of loyalty and betrayal, while art and literature began to reflect the complexities of identity and allegiance. Shakespeare's works, written a century later, would delve into the very heart of these conflicts, providing a lens through which the struggles of the past could be examined anew. The themes of ambition, honor, and strife echoed in the minds of audiences, illustrating how the legacy of conflict had crafted not only governance, but a rich cultural tapestry that would endure well beyond the Tudor era.